So hello again. So my name is Bethany Young-Holt, and I'm the director of the Initiative for MPTs, or the IMPT, and we're a project of CAMI Health that's housed at the Public Health Institute. And I'm joined today by Hannah Rubens and Madison Lundgren, our research assistants, and our esteemed presenters, who I will be introducing to you in a minute. So we're delighted to be hosting today's Let's Talk MPTs webinar discussion with a virtual panel of MPT product developers and end user researchers and commercialization strategists. The webinars will provide an opportunity to hear from end user researchers and product developers involved in MPT R&D about the challenges for not just conducting end user research, but importantly using this research and the findings to effectively inform product development and commercialization strategies. So we do have over 90 people registered from across different time zones joining us, and as we wait for others, we invite you to type your name and your affiliation and where you're located into the chat function. We really try to, foster sort of a community type of feeling through these webinars. So we will be muting everyone during the presentations, and then during the question and answer time, you can unmute yourself to ask your questions, or you can enter your questions into the chat. So that we can, pose the questions for our speakers. The recording of the webinar, or the webinar, will be recorded, and then we also have related resources that will be circulating around after the webinar, and these are also housed on the website. So next slide. So incorporating social behavioral research, or SBR research, early and throughout the research and R&D life cycle has become increasingly recognized as a critical part of the product development process, as you all know. And to meaningfully align the products with end user preferences and needs, the timely integration of these findings into R&D product development and market access strategies is essential. So today's discussion on integrating end user research into MPT product development and commercialization strategies will feature presentations by some wonderful colleagues. So Mushira Elsan is co-founder of Routes to Results, and she will speak on utilizing end user research findings to inform product development. Andrea Thurman, or Annie, is from Conrad, and she will speak on TAF and the topical insert product development driven by end user input. Then we will have Liz Pinto of Evofem Biosciences, who will speak on how end user research informs commercialization launch. And also from Evofem is Karina Fidaz, who will speak on end user research and how it can inform launch in lower resource settings. Next slide. So as most of you are likely aware, MPTs are multi-purpose prevention technologies or products designed to simultaneously address HIV, other STIs, or unintended pregnancies in a variety of ways to provide women and end users choice. There are an array of about 24 MPTs in development with active funding. Most of these are in early stages of development, while some are in clinical stages. And if you're interested in learning more, you can check out what's in the MPT product development database, which is on our website at mpts101.org. MPT development is complex and it involves multiple research disciplines, including the traditionally more siloed fields of HIV, STIs, and contraception. And so recognizing these complexities, the initiative for MPTs was launched in 2009 as a product neutral body to foster an enabling environment for the successful advancement of MPTs. So initial support for the initiative came from USAID and subsequently from Bill and Melinda Gates Foundation, NIH, and more recently from several other funders. As the central hub for the IMPT over the past decade, we built a learning network for MPT for the field that brings together multidisciplinary stakeholders. And as the product neutral body, we really advocate for the whole field rather than any particular product or approach. So next slide. So I want to just share with you, sort of as this platform, some of the resources that we provide. So next slide. So importantly, in 2002, and relevant to why we're here today, NICH, with support from NICHD, we launched the Let's Talk MPTs discussion series, which aims to engage experts from diverse disciplines across the globe to help address MPT priorities and gaps. And the topics for these discussions have been informed by MPT partners. And this includes a webinar topic that we're going to be hearing today. Past topics are on this slide and include cervical vaginal microbiota on contraception, regulatory considerations when combining APIs, and many others. And these past webinar recordings are available on the website. And as with the past discussions, we will be posting this webinar on the website and really look forward to engage in lively discussion today. So the MPT website, IMPT website also serves as a resource center. Just to point you to some resources on the site, we have a social behavioral resource hub, which where the resources that are shared today, will, readings and so forth, will be housed or are housed. We've also recently launched a regulatory resource hub. And then we have other tools also available on the website. Next slide. Since launching the initiative, we've been tracking the MPT pipeline in an online database, and the database is available on the website. We are currently wrapping up our annual database, our product development update. So if you see anything that's missing, let us know. So next slide. So now I'm really excited to welcome our featured discussants. So Mushira Elsan is the co-founder of Routes to Results, and this is an organization dedicated to bringing, bridging the gap between people and science through collaborative research and strategic partnerships. Mushira has 14 years of research experience across the pharmaceutical, consumer, and public health domains, including MPT research. Mushira uses various qualitative and quantitative research techniques, and she's led research with her colleagues at Routes to Results across the Middle East, North Africa, Sub-Saharan Africa, and Asia. Annie Thurman has been a board certified and practicing OBGYN for the past 24 years. And Annie joined Conrad in 2009 and has been the local site principal investigator, our site sub-investigator in over 250 clinical trials that have focused on women's health products related to contraception, menopausal products, vaginal health, HIV and HSV2 prevention, and including MPT products. We also are really excited to have Liz Pinto with us from Evofem Biosciences. She serves as the Associate Vice President of Brand Marketing. And Evofem is a publicly traded company whose mission is to improve the lives of women through innovative healthcare solutions. In her role, Liz is responsible for developing and executing the commercial strategy, inline and lifecycle brand planning, and marketing efforts across consumer, healthcare, professional, and payer audiences. And Liz has over 15 years of commercial experience in the healthcare industry. And Karina Fedaz is also at Evofem, and she serves as the head of business development. In her role, Karina leads the company's business development, product and pipeline portfolios, new business ventures, and the advancement of access partnerships around the world. And prior to her time at Evofem, Karina has held various executive roles in finance, operations, business development, and mergers and acquisitions. So welcome again to our panelists. And so with that, I am going to hand it over to Mashira so that we can hear from her directly. Thank you. Mashira? I think you're on mute.
Classic, thank you. Thank you, everyone. Thank you so much for having us, IMPT. It's a real pleasure to share space with you all and the speakers as well. Before we start, whilst Artois has a strong background in both the industry and public health sectors and integrate the way market research is done in the pharma setting into our work where relevant, we have also been working in the public sector for over 8 years as an organization, and actually longer, including our own background pre-roots to results, and therefore wanted to take some of our colleagues who are currently working in the commercial setting and talk to them for advice and take their opinion. They've reviewed this presentation with us and actually talked to us about their experiences, which was really helpful. What we will say is that the divide is not as stark as people would think. There's a lot of similarities between both the commercial setting and the public health space. We were able to talk to two brilliant people in particular and would love to thank them in advance. Emma Goldwyn, who is a long-standing collaborator and commercialization expert, who's currently working in the pharma market research world, and Nick Ellis, who's working at Astellas Pharma. So, one of the first questions that we were asked to discuss from the IMPT was how would you compare an industry versus public sector approach to integrating SBR into impactful product design, SBR being social behavioral research. Before talking about the approaches to integrating SBR into public product design, we wanted to say that both sectors do integrate it across the life cycle of a product, and sometimes both don't integrate SBR from the outset. We're not here to say whether one is doing it better than the other. It is quite clear that learnings can be taken on board from both sectors and that both sectors incorporate SBR or market research into their processes. It is important to appreciate the differences, though, in the environment and the sector goals. The industry sector is driven primarily by commercial impact, whereas the public sector is primarily driven by social impact. We say primarily, there are many examples of pharma companies with public health sectors or arms and public sector organizations with private sector capacities. Crudely, and there can be crossover, of course, this image is just to set the stage. One sector is trying to resolve the needs and issues with the greatest return on investment on the left, the commercial impact. The other is trying to resolve needs and issues with the greatest positive human impact, the social impact. And that is not to forget that sometimes a social impact case is built around commercial factors. And we will see in later presentations by my fellow colleagues colleagues that this is true. And sometimes the industry case is supported by social impact corporate responsibility. So what's in your business case? Ideas and products with the industry sector therefore need to be built on strong business cases in order to make it to commercialization. Business cases are built on evidence and data. and so are social impact cases. This slide can show the differences between the two spaces that we've found. Long-term plans in the industry empowers the development of products with space to change and iterate. Whereas sometimes the 5-year grant periods in product development in the social impact space makes the environment enable many ideas and early stage development, but perhaps moving down the line can be difficult. In this space, groups and developers compete for grants, whereas in the pharma space, they have their own money and products compete for space there. The danger, of course, of the commercial space is that ideas and products can be killed quite early, and perhaps the opposite is true of the social space. The middle ground is one where ideas can be heard, nurtured, and evaluated. So researching innovation is a continuous process. And how do we define a process? It is a predefined sequence of activities that guides a new product development from earliest stages of brand vision and idea generation to successful market performance. So many companies actually have formal systems in place that reflect the innovative processes that works for them. We found that some of these companies incorporate rigor and discipline in their innovation processes, and the most successful ones do this actually without hampering creativity. In the ideal situation, there is one overall process that the entire company uses, so innovation teams or product developers know what they have to do and demonstrate in order to secure resources for their projects. However, even with the commercial setting, there can be challenges. Firstly, some processes usually start with idea evaluation and can skip the critical stage of idea development. In some companies, feeding the funnel, like the image is presenting, is a separate process, while in others, there is no formal process at all. Some companies hold an internal brainstorming session and think they're done with the idea development. Idea development must emanate from a thorough understanding of the consumer and the market, which then translates into innovation strategy. Secondly, the processes aren't inherently nurturing, and as mentioned before, can kill ideas rather than helping them to make them stronger. The process by its very nature is about progressing through key milestones or gates by demonstrating that certain hurdles have been met. If these hurdles are not met, sometimes products get killed prematurely. Some processes also stop at launch stage without any formal follow-up in place to monitor the product's in-market performance and reasons behind that performance. So what research can be done? We've used this table for many years, and it has its genesis from our commercial days and working with industry and pharma, whereby many different types of research, including SBR, are utilized. The research types depicted in the table can actually move between the life cycle phase points. Many can be used multiple times at various stages, and it can be very helpful to repeat research and monitor changes and adapt product accordingly. This is an iterative approach and not necessarily just a linear one. And there are some really important caveats. How we've been talking may be described as quite crude. Firstly, so much of what is done in pharma in terms of product development is based on scientific discovery, which is not necessarily based on the end user need. We do not want to give the impression that every single idea is generated through understanding the end user, as just described. So much of what pharma spend R&D is based on scientific parameters too. It's a complex balance, what is feasible and what is desirable. In many ways, feasibility comes first, and then acceptability is tested later. The ideal situation is having multiple ideas to test. Secondly, a lot of the time in the industry sector, the end user isn't just the patient, but it's the healthcare provider, in the pharmaceutical world in particular, as they are a critical gatekeeper, and not necessarily the patient. This can be a very different approach than the social impact work. Of course, there are projects centered around the patients. They are often cursory, built to gauge an initial understanding of the patient as it would naturally impact what is designed, for example, patient support programs, which our colleagues mentioned multiple times. Thirdly, much of the spend can be already done for brands that are established. Sometimes it's about extending the brand and its reach. Pharma companies have brands and will develop brand plans. Everything done should be supported by evidence for that brand. The second topic that IMPT asked us to think about were the considerations from our own work and in terms of integrating end user research in the early formative stages of R&D. There is so much incredible social behavioral research within the social impact space. SBR is ideally placed to support early formative stages of R&D, from journey or motivational research, early stage concept testing, KOL discussions, and user design work. Feedback from SBR at this stage can help draw on deeper levels of understanding, which inevitably can impact the design or approach or focus of a product, as well as narrow down on options or routes to take. Looking back at our work, we really wanted to bring together these considerations on a slide. Our work has been at various stages, from idea to concept to product generation, research and development, as well as those brands and products that are already in market. We have 6 main considerations for the group, and I'm going to list them here and provide some examples in the next few slides to express what we mean more fully. So the first one is co-create to understand and build. Secondly, engage science with the human factor. Thirdly, understand the environment your product is living within. Then allow for change. Talk to as many stakeholders as possible, and understand that building consumer appeal is only one part of the puzzle. And all of this is incredibly important at the research and development stage. So let's look at this in a little bit more depth. Co-creating concepts with end users and then testing and refining them enabled a really deep look into what consumers see as the category and product value, as well as what information is critical to share and address. This is from some work that we conducted with the Population Council and the Bill and Melinda Gates Foundation, as well as a finding that we developed from work with the MTN, Microbicide Trials Network, and McGee's Women Research Institute. The consideration 1 was about co-creation. Concepts are this critical first interaction with the product. Consumers can make up their minds on very limited amounts of information up front. So we have to get to the heart of their needs and product benefits, as well as allaying concerns very quickly. Importantly, what the emotional story, as well as the product benefits, are built on are the product attributes themselves and how they make people feel. Therefore, understanding and co-creating these communications, even from an early setting, is invaluable, as what you learn about how the end user feels is inevitably built on how the product is designed. Here you can see 4 concepts we co-created with the end users around a contraceptive method, revealing the emotional and critical product statements that had all come from how the product is designed or worked. We are currently exploring some end user feedback on early stage microarray patches and its product attributes, all housed within what is feasible. And this is part of consideration 2, engaging science with the human factor. Being able to investigate reactions to product designs and features, especially those that can be developed or changed within the boundaries of what is technically feasible, provides a strong framework for analysis as well as evaluation for the end user. What can be changed or refined is a priority. What is ideal may not lie within these boundaries, but most end users don't make decisions in the ideal or with ideal choices. So it's not to fret about it. Enabling trade-offs around various attributes in a realistic decision-making context for consumers is very powerful. This kind of data is vital for product developers as they work to create a product that is technically viable as well as, ideally, desirable. This image is from our qualitative discussion with end users, where we have designed a bespoke card exercise looking at the attributes and trade-offs. The attributes and trade-offs took a couple of months to actually build through an Excel spreadsheet where we actually created a matrix across multiple attributes and each level. These levels were all parameters that could be refined, and those that in terms of currently and potentially. And so we built and designed cards so that the end user could utilize these to decide which factors and which attributes they wanted the most and which levels were most appropriate or acceptable. We did ask them again, which was ideal and which was acceptable, to understand that there could be those which are acceptable, but not necessarily ideal. These included design elements of the products of the 6 grantees and product developers that actually are developing maps currently for contraception. Then we'll integrate these attributes into our quantitative study to determine the relative appeal an attribute has in motivating end users to use maps. We have also conducted a qualitative and quantitative research program where we have recently completed with Lindra Therapeutics and the Bill and Melinda Gates Foundation, looking at the Lindra monthly oral contraceptive, a product in early clinical trials and development. Here, we also asked end users what they thought about various product attributes and asked around preference for those that had scope for change in design or refinements, as well as those that did not, like size. We learned that ensuring the slippery coating meant that the size, which could not change, was considered more acceptable. Another important aspect that this work can illustrate is consideration 4, allow for change during research. Enabling a multi-phase social behavioral research program means tools that can be refined and tested throughout the research lifecycle. In R&D, things can change about a product, and the research needs to be able to reflect that. And this happened with this current study. Spaces between phases for reflection and refinement are critical for the project to breathe and respond, for the data to be meaningful. We have in all our work created pause points between research phases to consider our findings, make changes to the tools, whether it be from the consumer target product profiles, survey guides, or show cards, or concepts themselves. And finally, consideration 6. Consumer appeal is only part of the story. What does that mean? Whilst consumer appeal is vital to understand and build, there are 2 other aspects when thinking about new product impact. You'll see on this slide, in the middle, we call it choice frameworks. This is part of consideration 3. Context, like perception, is everything. Understanding the environment people are making decisions can be a major factor to understand the reasons behind their perceptions or choices with regard to your product. On the whole, a product wants to operate in the life of someone in a positive way, not to be disruptive, but to enable the continuation of a positive experience or to make life easier. Product design aspects influences the ease to which people can experience a product in their day-to-day. This extends to consideration 5, talking to everyone who you think would have an influence on the use of your product or an influence on the person you intend to use your product. The end user is not just the consumer. Quite often it's their partners, it's the people around them, it's the healthcare provider. This is an extension to understanding the context. Adding specificity, the context can be described by the end user, which is extremely helpful as you will then understand who their influences are. And it is critical to see it through their lens. However, speaking to the ecosystem, both personal and structural, can provide information on vital leverage points and barriers. Are you able to address the needs of those most influencing your user with the way you design or develop your product? And to the right of this slide is something we call demand dynamics. Understanding the potential demand and impact of the market environment and the systemic context is vital. And this can be done pre-launch, post-launch. It can be done earlier too. It's a way of conducting market reflective forecasting and modeling, which should be updated with data as much as possible. Utilizing data from consumer appeal, for example, and choice framework learnings are also part of building into a model. Consumer appeal can be strong, and we learned this in multiple studies that we have conducted. And yet, the in-market barriers can mute its impact due to the complex buying process, for example. The starting point for any model should reflect the information buying process for the product. Often, in pharmaceutical healthcare, the starting point is the healthcare provider. The more complex the buying process is for the consumer, the more in-market barriers there will be. Over-the-counter healthcare can be patient consumer-led and typically incorporating fewer in-market barriers. We learned on one of our projects that with one country had extremely high consumer appeal, but very high in-market barriers. Whereas the flip was the reverse was true for the other country, whereby it had muted appeal, but much smoother demand dynamics. In the end, they balanced each other out, but they came to the number of potential impact from a very different route. So designing a product to be one with lowest possible market barriers is something to consider. And of course, this depends on product feasibility and the country or market you're looking to for introduction. So thinking about the 2 topics again, we just wanted to round off on a final slide in comparing the industry as well as considerations for the work. We can see social behavioral research can be utilized at the initial R&D stages within both sectors, and it is done. Some use different processes and evaluation systems, and some have different funding environments. What is created at R&D stage can house both what is technically feasible and desirable. What is designed will be the basis for everything else: the value proposition, how end users feel, acceptability, ease. The environment may be very different with regard to funding or process evaluation. However, it is an essential tool from product development stages right through to product introduction and commercialization. Thank you very much.
Shara, that was wonderful. Thank you so much. That was excellent and so much rich information. If people can please hold on to your questions, put them in the chat. We want to make sure that we can have time for all of our presenters. So Mashira, thank you again. I know I have questions, so we'll hold tight.
Oh dear.
So I'm gonna pass it on over to Annie.
Hi, my name's Annie Thurman. I'm a professor of OBGYN at Conrad Eastern Virginia Medical School. And I want to thank the IMPT for allowing Conrad to feature our end user journey with the TAF Elvitegravir topical dual compartment insert. So I'm going to tell you the story of our long journey with this product. Go ahead, next slide, please. So this started, I came to Conrad in 2009. This started, I would say, maybe 2010, 2011. We got some very early end user input along with, we utilized some end user design firms, Matchboxology and IDEO, and we found that both women and men desired a product that was discreet, highly portable. You know, you can as opposed to tenofovir vaginal gel per se, you can take the insert in just a pill bottle. It doesn't have a discharge if it's used vaginally. We also found that end users wanted protection from more than just HIV, wanted a dual protection against HIV and herpes. Also, we got feedback that end users wanted an extended window of protection, so they could use this either precoital or postcoital. And by allowing some flexibility in the dosing, this would likely increase adherence. Also, there's a lot of different options potentially available. And while some end users want a product that is always present, other end users want an on-demand product so that they only need to use it when the risk presents. And then finally, a topical product as opposed to a daily systemic product was also desirable to a large portion of end users that we spoke with. So this was some of the thoughts behind why we wanted to develop a dual compartment or a vaginal or rectal insert. Next slide. So I'm going to tell you the story of this long journey that we took with this product. And, you know, like most things in life, hindsight is 20/20, and I wish I knew then what I know now. But I think it also illustrates how a product developer like Conrad was able to be flexible and respond to acceptability and end user issues, and really develop a product that is much more refined than when we started over 10 years ago. Next slide, please. So I'm going to go over these studies, but we have done extensive end user research on the dual compartment insert. We started off with a study called Conrad 117 with our first generation. At the time, we really thought of it as a vaginal insert, which contained tenofovir and emtricitabine. When we identified some acceptability issues early on in this first-in-woman study, we then pivoted and did several studies in the US on placebo products given vaginally. And then we actually partnered with some other groups and did placebo products acceptability studies in women outside of the US, in South Africa and Zimbabwe, which was called the Quattro study. And even as we found that this insert could be used both vaginally or rectally, we did a placebo acceptability study outside the US called the Desire study, or MTN 035. And a lot of these end user studies done in various populations for various reasons has really led us to where we are now with a refined dual compartment insert that has actually been tested in first in women and first in men studies. So next slide. Okay, so our first in woman study with a vaginal insert was called the Conrad 117 study. And we use this insert that's up here at the top, which kind of looks like a Certs candy. And we, on the good side, we found that after enrolling 51 women at our center here in Norfolk and with Marla Keller up in the Bronx, that these vaginal inserts delivered high mucosal concentrations of tenofovir and tenofovir diphosphates. And the modeled PD really supported activity not only against HIV, but herpes also. So this vaginal insert met all of the PK and modeled PD benchmarks, but we found that this insert dissolved slower than expected and actually had very suboptimal acceptability. It caused a chalky vaginal discharge. And I saw my bosses on this call, and I remember, and I'm sure he remembers too, after we saw the first patient down in Norfolk, I remember calling him and saying, you know, Houston, we have a problem here. So, you know, we completed this study and, you know, we did find that despite not disintegrating properly, the vagina is an amazing organ and delivers APIs very well locally. But we took this information and pivoted to develop a better vaginal rectal insert platform to minimize this insoluble material and improve the disintegration profile in a low fluid environment like the vagina. Okay, so next slide. So we conducted a study in the US here in Norfolk called the Conrad 134 study. These are all placebo vaginal inserts, and we were looking in with a speculum every 15 minutes up until 90 minutes. And we queried these participants about the acceptability, the ease of insertion. We were kind of thinking about, do we need an applicator or can these be inserted digitally? So a lot of these acceptability issues, building off of our previous design, were initially tested in this study in the US. So women used all 4 of these inserts, and we described with a standard form how long it took for the inserts to dissolve completely and to spread into the posterior and anterior vagina. Next slide, please. So we, you know, with the data that we had found in the Conrad 134 study, we actually took these placebo vaginal and rectal inserts outside the US and participated with our collaborators in 2 pretty really unique studies that provided very important data. First was the Quattro study, which enrolled 200 women in South Africa and Zimbabwe. And in this study, the women used a placebo film, a placebo vaginal gel, our placebo vaginal insert and a placebo IVR, actually our placebo IVR, MPT IVR. They used each of these products in a crossover design for a month. And then at the end of those 4 months, they chose which product they would like to use for an additional month. And we got a ton of acceptability and end user data from these women and some of their partners. Similarly, in the MTN 035 Desire study, placebo products, placebo topical products, placebo rectal douche, a placebo rectal suppository, and our placebo rectal insert were used by MSN and transgender women in Malawi, South Africa, Peru, and Thailand. The top line for both of these studies is that all of these products were appealing to different people. You know, none really won out as the one product that everybody wanted to use. And I don't think that should be that surprising to people who have worked with patients and prescribed contraceptives, for example. People want different things at different times of their life, and some people are ring enthusiasts and some people are gel enthusiasts. So, okay, next slide. With all of that end user research with placebo versions, we took this product in its refined form with the APIs now added, TAF and EVG, into this study called Conrad 146, which is the revamped Conrad 117 study. So we have a newly designed insert which disintegrates better, is more acceptable. And we actually changed the APIs from tenofovir FTC to a tenofovir prodrug, TAF, with elvitegravir. And the reason we did that and what we proved in this just single dose study was that by using these combination of drugs, we're really extending the window of protection. You can see that we have high levels of tenofovir diphosphate even 3 days after a single dose. And these findings were presented at R4P virtually last year, and the manuscript is ready to go to the journal. Final slide, or next slide. Next slide, please. So like the Conrad 146, the MTN 039 study took the desirable placebo rectal insert and tested it with the active products, TAF and EVG, among MSM and transgender women. Also, like the 146 study, this first in men and transgender women study was conducted in the US. Participants received a single insert rectally, and then like in the 146 study, we did PK and PD sampling over 3 days. And then following a washout period, the participants applied 2 rectal inserts, and again, were sampled over a 3-day period like we did in the 146. The data from this study is going to be available shortly. Okay, next slide, please. So I think, this has been a long journey. There's been ups and downs, but I think it really illustrates how, a product that was initially found to be highly, effective by PK and PD modeling, but it was unacceptable. And we knew it was going to be unacceptable because of the disintegration, and how we took that data and pivoted as a product development group and conducted some very informative and interesting studies with placebo versions, both in women and men, and have used that information to guide first in women studies and future studies. Last slide is next here. So I'll tell a little joke. I saw this thing on the internet about, when you go to the doctor's office and they say, how do you learn best? Verbally, written instructions, whatever. I saw this thing on the internet that said, I learn best the hard way. So I think that's kind of, I was so bummed that this insert back in 2013, which really delivered an excellent PK/PD profile was unacceptable. But through end user research and through our determination to develop an acceptable and effective product, we've moved from some lows to some highs. So, and I'm happy to answer questions at the question and answer session. Thank you.
Annie, thank you so much. That was so excellent, and I think your last slide really does hit the nail on the head on how this field just really demands persistence and pivoting and learning from our past work. So thanks so much. And I do want to just remind everyone, we have a lot of wonderful, rich presentations. So we're going to hold off on our Q&A so we have time to get through the presentations. Please post your questions in the chat or just hold on to them. So with that, I'm going to hand it over to Liz.
Thanks, Bethany. Good morning, good afternoon, everyone. And thank you for IMPT for having us here to talk about how end user research informs commercial launch. You can go to the next slide. So today, a few topics I want to cover. First and foremost, how end user insights can inform commercial launch strategies, how we can leverage those research findings to inform an approach, and then some considerations for launch strategies. And I'll wrap up my part of the presentation here with going through a case study of how here at Evofem Biosciences, we use end user research to inform the launch for Phexxi, in particular, our consumer launch strategy. All right, so you can go to the next slide. Okay, so as we've gone through today, I think it has become apparent that essentially end user research informs all aspects of commercialization. It both informs the product and product development, but also the experience. And when I say experience, I mean end-to-end experience, which I'll get into a little bit here. It informs relevance to end user and understanding the unmet needs, their motivations, behaviors. It helps us, provide a positive experience and comprehensive positive experience from awareness through trial, through retention, and as well as optimization post-launch. It also really helps to identify any potential barriers in the market. I think Mushira touched on that a little bit, which is a very important point. And then finally, it also helps us understand potential return on investment, or ROI. So it can help identify what's the demand, what pricing strategies are, what customers will pay for your product, and again, the perceived benefits as well as the barriers. So you can go to the next slide. So to take it a level deeper, how do you use end user research to inform your approach? Now, this isn't an exhaustive list, but this is really to demonstrate the questions that different types of end user research can help answer. And all of these answers inform strategies for your end user, but also for different stakeholders like healthcare professionals, physicians, or payers. So I call this the 5WH approach. So it really helps answer questions like, what is it? So how are you going to describe your product? What category does it fit in? Does it create a new category? How do you describe it? Why is it relevant? What's the unmet need, and how is your product providing the solution to that unmet need? Who will benefit? Who's your target end user? How do you reach them? How do you talk to them? When is it used? When is it used in their time of life, or their life journey, or their disease state journey? All the way down to the actual dosing. When do you take it, and how do you take it? Where does it fit in to their life, to their lifestyle? And also, where does it fit into their mind? What are the perceptions? What's the positioning of your product within the minds of your customers? And then finally, how do they use it? how do they get it? How will they become aware of it? And how do they want to experience it? And again, how much will they pay for it? So you can go to the next slide, please. So considerations for organizing and pulling together all of these answers into a launch commercialization strategy. A few key considerations that I've followed in launches and has proven to be beneficial. So first here is educating on that unmet need. And that unmet need is determined by end user research. But must be, communicated and educated across to all key stakeholders that will be involved in your launch. So in the example of pharmaceuticals, all the way from your payers, pharmacies, advocacy, policymakers, to your healthcare professionals and your consumers. The second part here is to identify your target audience. Most companies, unless you're very lucky, don't have endless resources. So you really have to identify who your target and prioritized audiences are for launch. And post-launch that can expand, but again, without endless resources, you have to really hone in on who your target audiences are. You can do this through segmentation, targeting work, determining where the highest potential is. And just of note, in pharma, typically, launching to targets is phased and even starts pre-approval through your payers and your HCPs and your consumers. Third here is providing the solution, which is your product, as well as the relevant reasons to believe. Again, these relevant reasons to believe are often determined by end user research, but can be customized to each of the key stakeholders. And then finally here is curating the best possible experience for all stakeholders. And that's end to end from how they become aware of it through activation and ongoing. Especially with the launch, curating the best possible experience is super important because you only have one chance to make a first impression. You can go to the next slide. Okay, so diving into the Phexxi case study, in the interest of time, I'm just going to focus on the consumer stakeholders specifically, but note that there will be strategies needed for all of the key stakeholders. All right, so starting with the unmet need here, you can see some data that we educate on in terms of the unmet need. So 47% of women discontinue contraception because of dissatisfaction, and more women discontinue the use of hormonal methods versus non-hormonal methods. So again, really highlighting that unmet need for more non-hormonal birth control methods. You can go to the next slide. So really honing in on your target audience. One thing to note is that not all women of childbearing age are targets. Again, without having unlimited resources, you have to prioritize your targets at launch. So really, we focus in on sexually active women who are not fully satisfied with their current options, or those women who don't want to use hormones and are open to other birth control options. Another good way to do this is to create patient segments or profiles that can outline, what motivators are, what barriers might be, as well as all the way down to how to reach your target audience. And go to the next slide. So hitting on the solution or the product. So you can see here, the solution here being Phexxi, which is a hormone-free birth control, and really highlighting that hormone-free. And then again, highlighting that Phexxi is hormone-free birth control gel that puts the woman in control. So having this relatable approach and highlighting what the solution is to the current unmet need. You can go to the next slide, please. All right, here. So again, being considerate of the end-to-end experience So again, from awareness, where are you meeting your patients or your end users, meeting them where they are? So in this case, you can see we have social, we've run some TV, and it's not just meeting them where they are, but meeting them where they are in a meaningful way that resonates, but also while acknowledging who and what may influence her decision. So, you know, there's herself that can influence a decision, but also her partner, her friends, her doctor, her past experience with contraception, as well as different marketing conditions can influence her decision, and really being mindful of that as you're trying to drive your audience to activation and trial of the product. And then, you know, finally, the adherence part or retention. So ensuring that the process is as seamless as possible, that the product is easy to get, and that the user has as positive an experience as possible. You can go to the next slide. And I have to say this, but this slide shows the important safety information for Phexxi, such as women with recurrent UTIs should not use the product, and common adverse events were genitourinary in nature. For more information about Phexxi, you can see the product information at phexxi.com. Next slide. So in summary, as we've heard throughout this webinar, end user research informs all aspects of a commercial launch. It can be leveraged to inform the approach strategies through answering the 5 WH questions. And again, when launching, key considerations include educating and establishing that unmet need, identifying your prioritized target audience, and providing the solution in a meaningful way, and finally really curating that brand and product experience. And each of these are ultimately informed by end user research insights. So thank you, and with that, I will turn it over to my colleague Karina.
Hi, everyone. Thank you, Liz. And thank you, Bethany, Hannah, and Madison for having us here to chat with everyone and appreciate IMPT, especially in that endeavor. I'm picking up where Liz left off on the end user research and how it can inform launch in lower resource settings. So I'm coming at it from a business development aspect. I'm the head of business development at Evofem, and recently joined a couple of months ago. So I'm still drinking from a fire hose. Next slide, please. First, what I'd like to do from an agenda perspective is go through how business development might look at prioritizing rest of world globally. And then considering what we need to take into account for lower resource settings versus higher resource settings when we are prioritizing countries. And then, of course, acknowledging that that we may have to partner in certain areas, given that we don't have the expertise and others do. So partnering for impact is key in that case. Next slide, please. So business development generally, when you go out rest of world, from in our case, the United States, we are looking at what countries are the strongest profitable markets, what might be opportunity markets, and then where we might have to donor partner, recognizing we don't have expertise in those markets. In this case, in this particular slide, we looked at the World Health Organization's country healthcare development ranking, Human Development Index, healthcare coverage index, and contraception prevalence rate, to kind of bucket these into 3 different categories. Next slide. And then how did we prioritize the countries based on key aspects for our company? In that case, and this is just in general as a business development aspect, market performance as an opportunity, market brand pricing, policy access and reimbursement, regulatory and patent considerations, and of course, social and cultural behaviors. These might be different from company to company, as it is with respect to business development. We have to look at things a little differently when we are looking at countries where there may be lower end lower resource settings, excuse me. I'm fighting a cold. Next slide, please. So those considerations in lower resource settings versus higher resource settings include access, and this is not an exhaustive list here, but these are some of the considerations to really keep in mind. Access, pricing, culture, and then of course there's plenty others. For example, with respect to Phexxi as a product in lower resource settings, how do women currently get their contraceptives? Are there systems for delivery and distribution? What's the infrastructure like in the country? And are there storage and temperature requirements that are different from one country to the other? How are the end users aware of their options currently? What is the cost of the current alternative methods? Does our product cost of goods sold allow for competitive pricing? This is actually one of those areas where I feel R&D can really be of use, is to kind of look at what alternatives might there be from a cost of goods sold perspective to make things easier for pricing in those territories. So for example, with Phexxi, we have an applicator, an application plunger. Is there a way to create something that might be reusable or is perhaps not as costly as an application plunger? R&D can really benefit in that way. And then of course, culture, what are the expected norms associated with contraceptives in those territories? Is contraceptive a welcome part of family planning, or is it considered taboo? Is there more education required around the subject? And how do you do that? And then of course, what other considerations are we missing? Are we not thinking about? And who can we partner with that might have the knowledge of that particular setting? Next slide. So for us, you know, I'm going to outline this case study here pretty briefly, but we are partnering for success in several countries with Adjuvant Capital and Man Global Health, and moving to bring Phexxi to those lower resource settings based on those partnerships. We knew we would need donor-supported funds to subsidize the product cost and bring Phexxi to market. And so with Adjuvant Capital and Man Global Health, we looked at how we were going to target those end users in those lower resource settings. And in this particular case, I'm looking at Nigeria as our case study, but there are other countries that we are partnering with as well. And contraceptive use was one as well. And so contraceptive use, that is to say, we're looking to see women not currently using a contraceptive. And then secondly, women currently using another non-hormonal contraceptive. So in the first case, it could be the pull-out method or no method at all. And the second case being potentially like condoms. The other target population is, from a demographic perspective, adolescent girls and young women, 15 to 25 in low-income countries that align with those donor funding and life trajectories. And then secondly, 25 to 49 in middle-income countries where there's an alignment with the higher purchasing power that might exist there. In all cases, when looking at the countries that we've chosen for selection, it's been based on a need, demand, and the enabling environment associated with each of those territories. Next slide, please. And so that application of that country criteria took shape around several pillars. But to summarize, it's been centered around a country's family planning initiatives, how significant donor funding has been in each of those countries, and ease of market entry related to policy and regulation, and the unmet need in contraceptive use in that country. And Nigeria scored very high in all of those aspects, hence the reason why it was one of our chosen initial launch areas. We continue in our journey with Nigeria at this point to engage in additional consumer research to further guide our launch strategy specific to the country, because we have not officially launched there, but we are working again to do that, and we'll be continuing to get more and further information that we can bring to light here in further discussions later. So in summary, there is certainly a general way of looking at end user research from a global commercialization strategy. There is certainly a practical way that includes end user research. And I had mentioned those when we were talking about access and pricing and culture. And then of course, there's an actual way based on company resources and the partners that you can gather in order to really understand the end users in any lower end resource market. And so with that, I'll turn it back to Hannah and Bethany and Madison. Thank you.
Thank you so much, Liz and Karina. That was just fantastic. I think all of these presentations have just really been so enlightening. So I know people are on the Evofem side are fighting cold, so or otherwise. So thank you again for joining. And so now we're going to transition over to our question and answer time. So we've gotten a couple questions submitted, through sort of in advance of the webinar, but I actually saw that several of you have submitted some questions in the chat. So I'm going to ask Joe, I'm seeing Joe Romano posed a question here, 2 questions. So Joe, can you unmute yourself? I think it's really nice if people can sort of pose your questions in your own words, if that's okay with you.
Sure. Hi, everyone. This is Joe Romano, and thanks to all the presenters for excellent, very highly informative and detailed presentations and sharing of information and experience. Very good. Unfortunately, I was paying attention to this on the phone, so I could not see slides very well. So I apologize in advance if what I'm about to ask you did clearly address and I just missed it because I couldn't see it. My question is this: on the technical side of things, development is typically or should typically involve risk assessment from the early stages. What is technically going to be a challenge, and what is from a regulatory perspective going to be a challenge, and how much of a risk is that? There's like a 1 to 5 scale you can use. And then what's the risk mitigation strategy going to be associated with that? I'm assuming that it's similar, there are similar risks, not technical, but risk assessment is appropriate for the assessment of social behavior research needs for addressing strategies around product development. In the case of technical risk, there are formal processes and procedures out there produced by international organizations for purposes of assessing the technical risk. Are there common or well-established approaches for risk assessment from the social behavior side? In other words, for example, at some point, is it necessary to know broadly what the end user acceptance risks are, what the social or public health impact risks are, so as to be able to inform product design early or as early as possible on assuring that the development efforts are going to be consistent with adjusting those social behavioral risks? Hope that wasn't too long and makes some sense.
Thanks so much, Joe. Who would like to take to address that first?
I can just, one perspective that I have, Joe, is that I think that studies of topical HIV prevention products or oral HIV prevention products recognize that there are social harm risks with using the products, and those social harms or socio-behavioral risks may trump end users' ability to use an effective product. So I think that at least I think it's important in implementation studies to track not only sort of medical adverse events, but social harms risks to inform the field about that. I think that's a little adjacent to what question you ask about formal socio-behavioral risk assessment, but I'll defer to my colleagues on that. But that was the thing I thought of when you asked that question.
Thanks, Annie.
Great, thanks, Annie. Mishara?
Hello. Thanks, Joe.
Feel free to turn on your video, everyone, so we can sort of have more of a community feel if you'd like.
Hello. So Joe, thank you for that question, which in many respects blew my mind. I think the aim of social behavioral research is to understand risk factors entirely in the way that you're understanding barriers as well as leverage points. And I think it's about all those considerations. If you wanted to understand risk, you would talk to all the stakeholders, for example, from all the way from payers through to pharmacy committees, about the level of acceptability for the product, for example, even at early stage, as well as considerations for modeling and forecasting, which can tell you at an early point whether your product is going to have a strong uptake, or who is it, where your product is going to be cannibalizing market share from, which can also be important because, essentially you may not want to be cannibalizing from products that are actually complementary or supportive of your own. So I think social behavioral research can really understand risk in a very broad way. I'm not sure if there are very clearly defined processes. However, there are ways and techniques of being able to talk to each one of the relevant stakeholders who will be making decisions in terms of the impact of your product within social behavioral research to get the answers that you need. That's all I have to say on that, Joe. But if I've misunderstood, do jump back in and let me know. Thanks.
That was very helpful. And I appreciate the appreciation of risk assessment. I am frequently concerned, having been in this prevention field for HIV for almost 30 years.
Yeah.
Geez, sorry. Anyway, an understanding of the the importance of assessing risk early on so as to inform TPP structure as well as design and development strategies is critical. And I still have concern that it's all too frequent that certain risks are not assessed early enough, and huge amounts of money in a world where funding for development is not easy to necessarily access.
Yeah.
That there's somewhat of a intentional avoidance of risk assessments to allow for development to go on with funding for an extended period of time. And that's not really helping if indeed there are big risks that can't be assessed. So, and from my perspective, social behavior knowledge, risk around the accuracy and robustness of those data are just as important as anything you're going to do on the technical side.
Mm-hmm.
So
yeah, absolutely. I think there are strategies, and at least there's techniques and ways to develop research to support technical. As we spoke earlier, it's that balance about technical feasibility as well as acceptability, and both have to be brought together and share a space in order to actually, support the technical development of a product along its journey. Not to just devise a product and then look for ways to convince people to have uptake, but actually support its journey from idea, whichever stage it's at, with research in order to actually uncover if there would be potential barriers, which can actually be supported or, as already been discussed, pivoted by Annie. It could be changed to actually support greater uptake and use. The initial data from a forecast may be a difficult one to swallow, but actually can actually provide information on where to look for opportunities for refinement on your product or messaging even, or your TPP for how early you do it. So to build that in, to be actually a partnership, social behavioral research with development, which is being done, but to make it a genuine iterative approach, and partnership is how you can support uncovering risks and then uncovering how you can actually develop strategies to minimize or at least work around them or admit defeat.
great points all. Thanks.
Yeah, I thought Mishara, I thought that you also raised a really interesting point about not the risk of killing products too early that might be very successful otherwise. So I thought that you've had some really interesting perspectives in there. I'd like to also sort of highlight a question from Ariane. Ariane, do you want to, Ariane Bonderstraten, and would you like to put yourself off mute and ask your question directly?
Sure. Hi, everyone. Thanks for a great set of presentations. This goes to all of the presenters. You probably are familiar with the adoption of innovation framework that Rogers developed primarily for agricultural purposes, but that has been used also in the health field. And as we have a bunch of new products, including MPTs, that will eventually reach market, I'm wondering, have you thought about one attribute of a product that may be important for adoption, which is triability? And how do you think about it for the products you've been presenting or talking about, or in the journey that you've presented about adopting these new technologies? Thank you.
Thanks, Ariane. Who would like to start with that? And Ariane, I don't know if everyone knows what you're talking about the Rogers, but we can come back to that. But if you have a link to that, that might be interesting. Somebody just privately messaged me that. So if you have a link to that, that would be great. I don't know if this is something that Annie, Ariane's question is something that you've thought through at Conrad, or if anyone else has comments on that.
Yeah, so Ariane, I think one of the things you asked, I was writing it down, that how do we assess trialability of these products early on? So, I hope what you mean is, getting some early adopters to use it and tell their friends about it. And is that what you were asking?
Both at the population level. So how do you create the momentum for these early adopters? But then also, I think some methods are more complicated to try and decide whether you like them or not. So how do you think about triability for different type of methods? Those some that are very reversible, for example, are easier perhaps to try and decide, okay. And those who are long-acting maybe have less potential for triability. How do you think about that?
Yeah. Got it. Okay, no, that's a really important question, and I think we can use like lessons from the contraceptive field. Like I remember when NuvaRing came out, some women were not so excited about using a vaginal ring, or they had some weird thoughts about it. And, we would just insert one in the clinic and then they were fine, so that would be one example. And I also think, like with implants or biodegradable implants, the ask is a little bit different because the removability is, it's a longer duration than just taking a pill or trying a ring. I think that along the development pathway, what I do is a lot of phase 1 studies in women that are not end users of the product. We tend to see older women who have their tubes tied, who, live in the US and are not ultimate end users of these products. But what I think is really important about my population is we can identify early on highly unacceptable issues in products. And that is important to know before you move along in developing. And then I think, triability, when you get to, young women in sub-Saharan Africa and those populations, that's really when, people like Mushira, Routes to Results, Matchboxology, IDEO, all of those people are super important because you know, I'm a middle-aged OBGYN and I don't know what, you know, the young people are interested in anymore. I know all about the product, but I don't know how to get them to try it. So I think it's important that we have end user input along the whole thing early on to identify highly negative aspects. And then as we, you know, refine and pivot, we rely more and more on, you know, defining the end user who will be using the product. I think there's some themes that are universal. People want safe and effective products. They want control over the products. But the nuances that are super important of why would you or your friends try this product? I will have to defer to the FEXI people and Mushira on that.
I mean, I would just chime in and say, you know, it's all about finding who your target audience is and being very honest with yourself about where your product fits in. So, you know, I know it was mentioned with contraceptives, like, you know, Phexxi is a non-hormonal vaginal gel that's used on demand. That's not going to be for everyone. You know, someone who wants a longer term or semi-permanent solution like an IUD is not going to be someone who would want to use Phexxi. So it's about being honest with yourself and finding who the segment of your consumers end users, as well as you know, their healthcare professionals, to explain what the benefit is to that target audience versus, you know, kind of, you know, thinking that, for example, Phexxi is for everyone, which, you know, as much as we would like it to be, it is not.
Can I just build on that just real quick? I think, you know, that a lot of times in the HIV prevention field and the MPT field, we do talk about, you know, lessons learned from the contraceptive field. But ultimately, these products are not contraceptives. They don't, you know, they're going to be viewed differently than contraceptives by different people, by different stakeholders. And, you know, to echo what Joe said, I think there's limited funding. And so we're all trying to develop like the perfect product that everybody will use for their entire life. And that's not realistic, you know. And so I think it's only when we get some differences out there, like, yeah, you know, there are going to be Phexxi enthusiasts out there, and there are going to be people that never want to use Phexxi. And that's okay, because there's different products, you know. But I don't think we have that advantage currently in the HIV and MPT field. We don't have a lot of different choices to offer women. And so it puts, you know, it really puts pressure on the product developers and the funders to make sure, you know, we get the perfect product. And I think we've learned a lot, especially the importance of end user research. But we have to also be realistic that, you know, not everybody is going to want to use, you know, product X or product Y. We know that in the contraceptive field. I think we have to really be honest with ourselves in the MPT and HIV prevention field. So, you know.
So I have a question that came in that's related to this, and maybe our Evofem colleagues, our Bashira, could even think about this too. But this is a question. Here's a question. I don't know who submitted it, but how can commercialization strategies be built into the earliest stages of product development, including preclinical testing?
So, I mean, I think a couple of things, and, you know, I think Moshira also may have touched on this. So I think it depends on the organization. So if it is an organization that is working on their first launch, let's say, and so really the organization is built just, you know, currently without a commercial team. I would say a couple of things. I would say, one, do the research and kind of at least know where you're heading with end users and key stakeholders as early as possible, because that can certainly inform the trajectory of the study and product development, as well as, even down to the label. And that's the second part, is I would say it can, be important in order to develop the study design, and even maybe some secondary endpoints. I think, quality of life endpoints have become a very popular way, and those can be developed early on with understanding end user insights. But I would say that the third part is, if there is not a commercial organization in the earlier phases, to at least have a consultant or hire a commercial expert early on, because they can really help inform, again, those whether it's the endpoint, secondary endpoint, study design that could be meaningful to the end user and just contribute to a more successful launch.
That's great. Thank you. I think, I think that really highlights, I think, sort of one of the gaps that the IMPT sort of, and through our assessments and looking at priorities and gaps in the field, I think what you just highlighted, Liz, is one of the gaps, and the importance of, supporting that kind of end user research early on to inform the commercialization strategies. Because at the end of the day, the goal is to ensure that these products that are being developed will reach the hands and other parts of the body of the end user, so women and adolescent girls in particular.
Yeah.
So very good point.
Yeah, and I know it's a risk to hire commercial early, but even like from a contractor standpoint, I know oftentimes on different launches that I've worked on, where commercials brought in at a year out, in a good scenario 2 years out prior to launch, and then the commercial team is quickly running and scrambling to gather insights and what we can for a successful commercialization. So the earlier the better.
Yeah, and taking in perspective, both in your cases, the sort of upper income markets, and then also, those considerations for lower and middle income countries too. So, I think we could all go on and spend hours talking about this, but we don't have that much time. So we are wrapping up. I just want to thank all of our presenters again so much for taking your time and preparing these presentations, sharing very generously your expertise, your lessons learned. So thank you again. And to everyone who is on as a participant who joined us today as well, thank you so much for your interest and support. We will have, as we noted earlier, we will be posting this webinar and the recording and the slides on our website under the resources. The slide I showed at the beginning, we do have a learning events portal or hub where we house all of these resources and webinars. We also on the, if you could go back to the next slide really quick, Hannah, thank you. We also have a place where people can contact us and just, if there are topics that you think would be valuable to address, please, just message us. If you go to our website, there's a place there where people in the community can respond. So we do have a next webinar next slide. Thank you. We do have a next webinar coming up. And this is based on feedback that we've gotten from our partners, and that is patenting and intellectual property considerations for MPTs that actually apply to HIV prevention and other products that are in development related to MPTs. And as you'll see here, we have a really great group of panelists for that. We're finalizing the date around sort of IAS that's coming up into June. But yeah, so with that, I want to thank everyone again, and and our NICHD as well for supporting this series. So hope everyone has a good rest of your day, evenings, and hopefully we'll be in touch. Thanks again.